Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Bologna Institute for Policy Research seminars that we have every week on Mondays and Thursdays. And today's session is one that I'm sure you're going to find extremely interesting and extremely pertinent to your studies here at SAIS Europe. We're going to be talking about Europe and the Mediterranean and the Middle East under the title Borderlands, which is the title of the book that came out just a couple of months ago by Professor Raffaella del Sarto, and which in a way creates the framework for our discussion today. And in order to discuss concepts which spring from Borderlands, we have an extremely professional and knowledgeable panel. Raffaella herself, who is known to all of you. You've received the biographies in the announcement of the event, so I'm not going to run through them now. Kalypso Nicolaïdis, who until recently was and still is, I think, at the University of Oxford, but on leave and at the European University Institute, and who has written very widely on themes related to Europe and democracy and well beyond. I very much appreciated particularly Exodus, which made me feel a little bit better about Brexit. I mean, whenever I had a pain in the pit of my stomach thinking about Brexit, I turned to your book and I felt a little bit better about it after that. Kalypso has a new book coming out right now, which is available, A Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law. I'm sure this is something which you'll find extremely interesting and pertinent as well to your studies here. And we also have Simone Tholens, who has worked together with Professor Del Sarto, and they recently published a book on contestation in the Mediterranean Middle East, resisting Europe, the response of countries around the Mediterranean basin to the influence of Europe in the region. And that also, I think, will create an interesting framework for our discussion this evening. We're going to begin with a dialogue amongst the panelists. You are invited to think about issues you would like to raise, questions or comments. Those of you who are following the discussion online, please put in any comments or questions you may have in the Q&A function, and I will keep my eye on the Q&A and filter your comments or questions into the dialogue as we go along. But I thought we would begin by turning to Professor Del Sarto and asking, first of all, Raffaella, if you could share with us a little bit the thought behind the concept of Borderlands.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. So basically, the starting point of the book is to think about Europe. When I say Europe, I mean the European Union and its member states, the entirety. So the starting point is basically thinking about Europe expanding its different types of borders towards the so-called neighborhood. In this case, the so-called southern neighborhood, as it is called in Brussels, right? So we're talking about different types of borders. There can be functional borders. There can also be territorial borders, which are outsourced, let's say. So the starting point is really to think about the European Union and its member states as a composite entity with very disaggregated borders itself. Think about Schengen, think about the Eurozone, think about the internal market, and this modus operandi of Europe to try to basically expand the European order southwards. It's doing it also eastwards, right? But I've focused on the Middle East and North Africa. So this is the starting point, because then you start thinking about how to think about the relationship between Europe and its neighborhoods, right? And what we see is that the two sides are much more interconnected than we would think. In specific on specific topics, there is obviously a separation. If we're thinking about the migration issue, for example, then we can think about really Fortress Europe. But the whole picture is a bit more complex. And what it creates, it's basically creating some sort of borderlands by this constant expansion of rules, practices, regulations, also territorial borders partly. It creates a very hybrid zone. And in a way, North Africa and the Middle East are connected to Europe. So that's basically the starting point of the book. And it takes issue with some concepts that are very prominent in the European studies literature. So it's such as normative power Europe, and also with the fact that there has been a lot of discourse analysis on, again, in the European studies literature, by looking at what Europe wants to do by declarations, and not much about what the impact has actually been. And if you look at the Middle East studies literature, well, Europe does not always figure there very prominently. So that's as a starting point.
Thanks very much, Raffaella. Kalypso, would you like to comment?
Excited I'm here in Bologna with you in the room and you guys online. Finally, as a neighbor, having moved to Florence in our Mediterranean roots. And I think, Raffaella, how far we've come, because Raffaella and I started, working together and talking about these issues when it was all kind of going pretty well. There was the Euromed partnership in the 90s, and, post-Cold War, we were going to be a Mediterranean people, a Mediterranean culture, one polity. And there was a lot of dreams, and they were kind of poetic and beautiful in some ways. I mean, even if you are a realist and you understand there's power in the system, etc. And so here we go, 20 years later, more than 25 years since we started talking about all this, with some other books at the time. And I applaud enormously this book and so encourage all of you to pick it up. It's a real intervention. Not everything is an intervention that we do, we boring, book writers, intellectuals, researchers, whatever. But this is a real intervention in the world. Because, I mean, as Raffaella just said, the argument double debunks. It debunks a whole narrative of the EU as this bringer of stability. Well, it does bring stability in the region. In fact, over, peace and justice and social justice and all these other things. So when you hear the EU saying, oh yeah, we've exported stability, peace, justice, yeah, guys, you've exported stability, and that's trumped everything else. Now, of course, Raffaella is both super hyper provocative, but you've got to read it in the right way, because she's also cautious, even ironic. I love when you say the possible unintended, but not totally unforeseeable consequences of this European policy. Not totally, she's into British, understatements. She spent too much time with us in Oxford. So, and in fact, I would say that your book, one way or another, in your work, inspired a play we just did in Fiesole, where, for instance, one of my Egyptian students, inspired indirectly. It's the same mindset, whose father is still in jail, having been a deputy for Morsi, and whose mother met, what's her name, who was the, Catherine Ashton. Remember Catherine Ashton? Great choice as our first foreign minister of Europe. And, her mom, his mom in Cairo, talked with Catherine, and she said, we'll help you. And then she came back and said, well, sorry, guys, we can't. After Sisi came to power, yeah, your husband's in jail. Well, there's nothing we can do. You should hear Moaz's speech in the play. He's not totally happy with the EU. Let's put it, another British understatement. And so if I may give you kind of three big things about the book, as you already started to hear from Raffaella, she marshals, she critiques the world and what Europe does to this region, but also reigning academic principles, concepts like normative power that are in some ways too complacent about the EU. And we can't be complacent in this crazy world of ours, can we, these days? So, and I would just posit that there's three building blocks there. One is, Raffaella just described it, it's the title of the book, Borderlands. And lots is going on in these borderlands around and within the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean itself is a borderland. But it happens in this borderlands also in entrenching and contesting the functions of this borderland as instantiating, magnifying the asymmetries of power between the two sides of the Mediterranean and everything that flows from that. So, but there's much to say about this beautiful concept of borderland. But secondly, what is actually going on? What are we talking about concretely? Basically, there's a chapter, third or fourth, entitled, I think, Exporting European Order. And in some ways, the subtitle is, warning, Europe does not export its stated values. It exports a certain order. And that order can be characterized in various ways. And here I'm both speaking about Raffaella's book, but also we basically completely share the same diagnosis. This is not one of those moments when you can provoke the author and say, well, I disagree because I'm so sorry, but I kind of don't, I can't find anywhere. So Europe has colonial DNA, and we can revisit that question in our conversation, why we say that, why the book says that. And in the way, historically, but to this day. So it exports its political DNA. There are kind of two big ways in which things happen in this story. One is, you could call it the Brexit effect, if I can be provocative. This is just to wake up everyone. It's the EU being a regulatory and legal hegemon. We export the way we do things, from how we regulate, the way you grow tomatoes, to how you do your data, how you organize your government, your police, whatever it is, from the micro standards to the macro institution and everything in between. The EU needs to have little clones around itself in its neighborhood policy so it can deal with them more easily, but also so that it can extract values from it. And you don't need to be a Marxist to believe that. If you want to squeeze value, you export the way you do things, but except you do it better and you impose the way, and it serves your interest, but maybe not the other's interest. Sometimes it might serve the other side's interest, and we could discuss when. So there is this Brexit effect. And then there is, in addition, which wouldn't be the right metaphor with, and I said the Brexit effect because another beauty, Michael, of Brexit is that it makes visible these patterns that were invisible before, because damn Brits, they're such a headache. They can't swallow it and say, okay, you want to get in the single market, just copy us and copy our son. No, they're never happy, these Brits. They want to do their own thing. So they make this visible, that what's going on in the Mediterranean, where, we need Raffaella's book to make it visible in the Mediterranean. The second thing, though, is that indeed what Raffaella calls selective outsourcing. So all these border management issues, keep the people out, say the European public opinion, which I don't think is true, by the way, but I don't think the majority of European public opinion necessarily want to keep all the people out and see them die in the Mediterranean or being stopped. But that's externalizing your border management, and it's happening in such a grand scale, and the book is a lot about that, and we need to wrap our heads around what that means concretely in terms of babies dying in Ceuta and Melilla last month, but in so many different ways, which you're all very, very aware of. And all of this is done through what Raffaella refers to as the cooptation of MENA elites and governments in this management, in Europe's management of migration and borders, etc. And then the third big building block is kind of the biggest picture, the big picture, with what implication? What does it mean in the way we understand what Europe is? And Raffaella was saying, I'm contesting normative power, and we were just picking that up. And she has this term normative empire, which I think works much better than normative power, because there is an imperial DNA in this story. And what Europe does is indeed construct its neighborhood with lots of quotes around neighborhoods, because of course, if you go to these countries, you're like, why do you call me your neighbor? You're my neighbor. It's very centric, right? So suddenly all these countries are lumped as neighbors. That's kind of interesting. why should they be? So, but then of course, on the economic front, what's at stake here is that it is basically the exportation of more and more of a certain kind of economic system, neoliberal system, but under this broad label, we have, crony capitalism, state capture by economic elites, and all sorts of really not very pleasant things. But that corresponds then to the political, and I'm getting to the end of my intervention, is that these neoliberal restructuring processes that are kind of encouraged by Europe are made possible most of the time by authoritarian regimes that hijack these processes for their own profit. Basically, putting money in their pocket is very straightforward and most human thing of all. Unless and until there's some revolution and the people dare to wake up and say something, but then it's not as though the absent of in this story is that, do we have a meaningful European intervention in support of civil societies that are revolting, or even in support of milder reform? Not really. So this is the absent in this big story. It's the big black hole, that Raffaella kind of points to in the book. And so in sum, what I see from the book, Raffaella, I've come up with something, you'll tell me what you think, the EU MENA Borderlands vicious circle. And the vicious circle is that here's the EU co-opting MENA states and their elites in the management of these borderlands, thanks to this structural power asymmetry. But two, that in turn gives these states and these elites some leverage over Europe. We're not going to do what you're asking us to do if, and that leads Europe then thirdly to directly support or at least acquiesce to authoritarian rule and economic suppression in this country, which in turn, and we're back to the beginning, makes it easier to co-opt them because there's no effervescence and people that can say no. So it's this kind of vicious circle, and the EU is at the minimum complicit, even though often with good intentions. And that's also the conversation we can have. So in sum, of course, it's not the first time that a scholar critiques the EU. So many of us are in critical theory, and we believe in tough love. It's not as though we want to be Eurosceptic, but we believe that serving the EU means critiquing the EU. But if you do, you will do very, very well to pick up this book that will equip you with the intellectual tools and the empirical facts to really magnify your power as engaged citizens in this world, and try to think from there, how could all this be made better? Maybe the next round of our conversation.
Thank you very much, Kalypso. I'd like to ask you, Raffaella, if you share Kalypso's characterization of Borderlands. And beyond that, I'd like to ask you whether the EU has a strategy towards the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Is the EU the main actor, or are European governments equally important actors? Can we speak of a strategy? And if so, what are its main elements?
Well, after these super nice words by Kalypso, I can of course only agree with her, obviously. As for, we had many conversations on that, and I should perhaps also say that the whole idea to look at the relationship between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East actually started in Oxford with a book chapter that I contributed to a book that you edited. So it has a very long history, and I'm also very happy that Simone is here because she worked with me when I had a grant from the European Research Council, for which I'm still very thankful. And we had basically 5 years doing research on the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. So regarding the strategy, of course it depends a little bit what strategy means, right? What I see is, again, if I adopt this idea, Kalypso mentioned that I also talk about normative empire in the sense, again, that's a bit of a provocative term, right? Thinking of the European Union as a normative empire in the sense empire because it's expanding borders. What have empires traditionally done in history? Well, they're interested in stability in the borderlands. Well, they usually have also invaded them, but I mean, that's the European Union is not doing that, right? So there is this idea that the interests are stability, because that ensures a security for the European core in this sense, and also economic benefits, right? So if we, and I call it normative again, not because it's about exporting the big norms, democracy, human rights, and so on, but it's about the little things, the regulations, the rules, the practices. So if adopting this perspective, then of course there is a strategy of trying to keep stability in the Mediterranean and blocking unwanted people and unwanted goods, right? So that strategy is, however, in my view, rather counterproductive, no? Because as Kalypso was just saying, I mean, it has really strengthened, it has contributed to the strengthening of authoritarian rule in the region. It has been basically, the European Union has co-opted governments to do, we could call it the dirty work of blocking unwanted migrants, right? And so if that is the strategy, if this is the idea of a strategy, then yes, Europe does have a strategy. Whether it's a very wise one, that I have my doubts about that, right? Because
Simone, could I ask you also, looking at the strategic approach of Europe, but also the response in the region? You edited this book together with Raffaella about contestation, and it's clear that there has been a strong reaction in the region. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit the sort of bottom-up view of how you see the governments and the peoples in the Mediterranean and the Middle East responding to this quasi-imperial policy that Raffaella and Kalypso have described.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me on this distinguished panel. It's a great pleasure, of course, to talk to you about this topic. And I was fortunate enough to work with Raffaella on the Borderlands project for several years. We were the Borderlandini, and it was great fun. And we really took this, I think, opportunity to go beyond some important discourses. And that's what I really think that, you know, and immediately appealed to me when I saw the job ad. This way of thinking about a site, which is a shared site where the Europe and the Mediterranean, Middle East, the neighborhood, what do you like to call it, overlapping and are entangled. And, you know, you will have alternative, you know, focus or alternative theoretical approaches. They talk about post-coloniality, they talk about Orientalism, they talk about, you know, kind of profoundly shared dynamics at play. But in the European studies literature, a lot of that is sort of just about really beginning, if at all, if I may say. Of course, you have critical voices, but the mainstream is not going to that length. So to be in the Borderlands space is actually, you know, a real opportunity. And I think, you know, in the Borderlands, things are really messy. This is the first thing, which helps us also to overcome some of our analytical challenges. We have to accept that things are messy, that things are certainly not orderly, and therefore sort of develop, you know, tools to study this messiness in a way. I mean, when we started the project, and I myself was working a lot on norm diffusion, and the European Union, its attempt to export norms were very much high on that agenda. So, and the problem with looking for norms, big or small, and kind of trace their linear adoption, and anything which isn't adoption would be rejection, is quite both, you know, it's basically a little bit of an illusion. And I think a lot of in IR, we like constructivists, early constructivists, very, very keen to focus a lot on the power of norms, so much so that we would go looking for norms everywhere. And, you know, maybe it is not the most relevant, maybe it's analytically a little bit useless actually. So I think what, the Borderlands as a concept that offered there was to consider norms, but really to see how, power is at play through norms, how things really look in practice, and how that shared area is governed by certain logics that really doesn't follow any particular scripts. So Raffaella and me had took one of the outcomes of this of the Borderlands project was this shared edited book that we were collecting contributions that were working on resistance in a sense. So these are, a lot of them are really European scholars, European studies scholars. But we wanted to bring these into a framework where we looked at resistance or contestation practices. And if you look at, of course, responses from MENA governments, they will be very diverse. I mean, this is a region just because someone said it's a region to some extent, right? I mean, there are really a few things in common, and then they are connected in some ways. Now, the European Union, likes to simplify things, and I do think that, partly when we talk about a European or a EU strategy and European neighborhood policy and so on, these are really discursive exercises, right? I mean, they do come with funding. They do have some kind of impact in structuring formal relations at the EU level, but there are also a lot, I think, about ontological security, who the European Union is and its identity and what it needs to do to defend that identity. So, this is a aspect. Now, so looking at this very highly diverse region, we wanted to look at the contestation practices and try to develop some type of understanding of how we can differentiate between them. And we found it quite useful to differentiate between thick contestation and thin contestation. And thick contestation would really be to challenge the legitimacy of the EU. We focus mostly on the EU, less on member states, to set the rules. And even try to impose its own rules on the European Union. And to some extent, we have one chapter talking about border management in the Turkey case. And this very militaristic way of doing border management, essentially. And somehow, this way of doing, which, Turkey wouldn't be the first one to invent, but in the context of the, EU neighborhood, way of dealing with things, actually, Turkey really imposed on, the EU as well, its way of doing border policies, border management. And we can also perhaps controversially perhaps argue that, the European Union also picked up on this. So somehow, new standards were set, if not norms. Now, however, we see more of the thin type of contestation. And this is where we get into that interesting way of looking at core and periphery. And we have an interesting chapter that talked about how traditionally in empires, in the periphery, things were done a little bit differently. And there is acceptance for this way of doing things differently. So what we could observe is that the European Union in its periphery would very much tolerate, that rules and norms were not implemented in the way that it was foreseen. But we see a lot of localization, we see a lot of adaptation, we see perhaps a formal adoption, but then things work differently in practice. We see it on the discursive level, which would be an explicit way. We see it also in sort of hidden transcripts. We kind of try to develop these typologies of resistant practices. And we're presented this book around a little, and we're getting the question, is this still very Eurocentric? Yeah, so somehow we look at the way that European rules, what happens to them as they are rolled out. But at the same time, we try to also, claim some developments toward, more decolonial approach to this, where we can see this as a shared site, where really, if you talk about how things are done, there is acceptance, there is, a development of certain practices, and this is it, sort of. Yeah. So that was the book, and yeah, I suppose the governments and reactions can purposefully be looked into this framework, but yeah, also other ways, I suppose.
Thanks very much, Simone. Could I remind our participants, particularly online, that you can pose questions or make comments using the Q&A function. I've got my eye on it, and I will echo those to the panel, and we'll have a moment when we pause, and those of you here will have an opportunity to intervene. Maybe I could just pose a couple of questions, which are based to some extent on a different eye view. You know, they always say where you stand depends on where you sit. And during much of the early period in which the EU was trying to develop this so-called neighborhood policy in the Mediterranean and Middle East, I was in Brussels, and I was really very much involved in all of this. And again, you could say it's a civil servant kind of eye view, but I don't recognize such purposefulness in the behavior of EU officials, even very senior officials, or even governments. What I recall, and it could be just level of analysis issue rather than anything else, were a series of improvisations. And, you know, of course, there'd been the older Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, so-called various early instances of this. But around 2003, 2004, the EU tried unsuccessfully, really, to develop its neighborhood policy as kind of enlargement light for Central and Eastern Europe. And we were running ahead, negotiating these deals with Ukraine. And the Spanish ambassador in Brussels said, wait a minute, you know, you're talking about neighborhood, but in Madrid, when we talk about neighborhood, we mean North Africa. We mean, you know, 700 years of Al-Andalus cannot be forgotten. And so the Commission didn't know what to do. And so what did they do? They immediately, just as they transposed the enlargement approach to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and so on, they quickly adapted exactly the same instruments, however ill-adapted, and offered these to the Mediterranean countries, very little trade concessions and so on. And then for the next 10 or 15 years, wondered why this model didn't really work. And also member states were very often at cross purposes, as we saw particularly in Libya. So is it a level of analysis issue? Is this very purposeful kind of imperial approach that you describe a sort of analysis after the fact? Or do you feel it's what drove policy over the last couple of decades or so?
Well, I think it is always very interesting to go back to history, right? And to go back to colonial history, basically. And what I would argue is that there is basically a red thread in a way, right? And that's the colonial policies of single, what then become member states, right? Over the decades, they became somehow Europeanized, I would say. So I completely agree with you that the neighborhood policy was basically, well, here we have an enlargement, we have to do something with the new neighbors, and looking at the East, and someone said, what about the South, right? But I also think that it's really, if we look at it from a modus operandi, you know, the way that the European Union has been, or the European communities before that has been working. So there has always been this approach of, well, keeping the region stable. There has always been the issue of trying, of course, natural resources matter, of course, markets matter, right? And so there has been some formulations and reformulations from the Barcelona process to the neighborhood policy, to the revised neighborhood policy, and the revised neighborhood policy, and so on and so forth. And I think perhaps the neighborhood policy is more explicit in that, in saying, well, we can do things this way, but you have to accept our rules. But it's already in the free trade agreements, right? And so there is a certain continuity in that. And I do also agree with what Kalypso was saying. Of course, if we're thinking of 1995, the launch of the Barcelona process, yeah, it was really a different time, right? And there was much more optimism in the air, right? And of course, as you were saying, I mean, power relations always matter and so on and so forth. But I think that, of course, there has been a change in recent years, with terrorism coming on the agenda, with the migration issue becoming much more important and being also politicized and so on. But I do see a certain type of continuity. And I think that we can capture this type of continuity if we think about it in terms of core periphery relations. And even more than that, I mean, the core is a very big core. And the single states in North Africa and the Middle East, they have not put their heads together. They don't confront or address the European Union as a bloc or as a group, right? So they're basically single states that have to deal with Europe or with the European Union. And I think in this core periphery perspective, and that has not changed, right? That has always been like that. And in this core periphery relationship, this is also what Kalypso mentioned before that, and also Simone. On the one hand, it is very clear that elites are co-opted, right? And that's typical of core periphery relations. The cores, they basically co-opt the cores in the peripheries, right? And there are shared interests between MENA elites and MENA governments and European elites. There is much less affinity between the peripheries on both sides. So this is number one. And number two is really what Simone was just talking about, that obviously there is interaction there, and there is this type of resistance and trying to adopt some rules, but not exactly that way, and so on and so forth, right? And that is something that the Europeans do also tolerate, no? And they know that, I mean, that's the rules of the game in a way. No? So I think that, yeah, I think considering from this perspective, well, makes sense to me.
We have a question from someone on the DC campus who expresses his appreciation for the talk and asks whether the EU and the US approach is distinguished by the fact that Europe has a colonial history with the region, and that this continues to characterize its relations, which is not the case in the same way anyway for the United States. I don't know who might like to respond to that, Kalypso, perhaps.
Definitely, the questioner is absolutely right, and Raffaella speaks of it in her book, and some of us have worked on the fact that yes, the EU came, as exactly in the late 50s, early 60s, when the individual member states, and especially France and later Britain, but also Italy, this very country, and we're decolonizing. And so it was a moment when Europeans, fed up with their colonial wars, were looking inside, doing their own thing. But the story doesn't stop here. And it's a story about denial of a past. It's a story about denial that the EU had anything to do with it. That's why I call it the virgin birth. Boom, suddenly the EU happens, or the EC at the time, and has nothing to do with the past of its member states. At least that's the narrative. You cannot find maps in, well, you'll tell us, Michael, that that's not true. You spend so much time in Brussels, but are there maps anywhere which shows an EU with Algeria as part of it? Founding, if you see a map about the beginning of the EU, there won't be Algeria. So there is a forgetting of that past, a narrative that, but the truth is that actually in the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of talk of Euro-Africa, North Africa, and the rest of Africa, which was about member states pooling their sovereignty in the EC in order to pool their colonies. Suddenly, let's have some economies of scale. It's going to be complicated to manage this big backyard. And they weren't thinking decolonization yet. And so actually, the management of colonies was part of the DNA, really, the foundational intention of the EU. And we forget that, for better or worse. And what does it mean today? Of course, it's subtle and complex, and we don't have an EU that's a colonizer as in the olden days. But the idea of the mission of the white man, or the civilizing mission, and the fact that, people will say, well, what's wrong with our norms? They're pretty good, high food standards. Why should you be against that? Or I don't know what, data privacy, whatever standards. They're good standards. It will be good for these people, the autochtone, to adopt our standards. There is, and I've talked with many people in the region who, will accept that the intention, because Michael, you were talking about the intention, of course, of bureaucrats, politicians, etc., is generally, well-intentioned. But it doesn't mean that as scholars, we shouldn't uncover the underlying, structures. And so you could look at those structures, they're ideational, a sense that we can tell others what to do and our standards are superior. It's for their own good, so paternalistic. But also, you know, let's be good old pluralists here. There are lots of interests, and Raffaella was talking about, there are just in the EU intentional, yes, there are industrial lobbies, there are agricultural lobbies. We want to export our products, but our industrial products, but not necessarily let their tomatoes in, you know, the tomato war, whatever it is. The EU is going to serve its own constituents. That's kind of, you know, and then there is the underlying structure of capitalism and what capitalism, you know, does. There is a logic of capitalism. And so, you know, where is intention and agency in this whole story? It's a complex story. Now, the US has some of these same ingredients. The capitalism story, the cooptation of elites, core periphery, but without that past, so without the baggage that is both perceived by the other side as something deeply humiliating and problematic, as something that authoritarian elites can exploit because they can also play with their diaspora in the continent and manipulate them. Of course, Turkey does this beautifully, the way they try to influence the votes of Turks in Germany, et cetera, and there are many other examples. So these ties are also sociological, and they're the history of the present and the presence of the post-colonial generations of third, fourth generation in the continent, and what that means for the foreign policy of the EU and the margin of maneuver and all of that. That would be my.
Thanks, Kalypso. If our questioner in Washington wishes to come back, please feel free to do so. I mean, you've touched on so many of these interests, the migration interest, trade interest, economic interest. There's also the security dimension. And I wonder, Simone, if you could say a few words to us about the kind of assistance that European countries have been giving to regional countries, if indeed there's a region, perhaps we shouldn't use that terminology, what kind of support they've been providing and what role that plays for European countries in their relations with North Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, so that's a very big topic, and I think, you know, Kalypso talked about in her introduction or in her first response that stability. We are, you know, in a turn, and I think we have to recognize that you know, the main priorities have dramatically shifted, and the EU is promoting, first of all, stabilization. Now, what does that really mean, and how does it kind of factor into a hierarchy of priorities? This kind of, you know, can be discussed. What I think, though, is that the European Union, and of course, the current agenda, current affairs, this is very, very topical, you know, calls to strengthen the security and defense capacity and capabilities and autonomy of the European Union is really a symptom of a broader trend, which the European Union and European actors in general want to be a part of. And that general trend is one that considers interventions, global security management, very much as an investment, a transactional logic, an investment return, you know, approach. And by that I mean that you know, forgotten are those long-term ground interventions whereby external powers would intervene, perhaps in the name of, you know, humanitarian or you know, other values, humanitarian needs, or attack on civilians and so on, assuming responsibilities, sovereign responsibilities over other countries. We have seen that in Bosnia, we saw it in Kosovo in the 1990s, where those type of you know, liberal peace interventions, state building, were, you know, certainly en vogue. And we just don't see those anymore. This comes down to, you know, the illusion with what those type of interventions could produce. Iraq, Afghanistan being particularly kind of traumatic events. But the thing is that that doesn't mean that we don't see interventions. We very much see interventions. They tend to be light footprint, based on advising, assisting, and not least equipping local security forces, state or non-state. And this comes with, so it is assumed, less responsibility, therefore less risk. And I'm talking both political risk and economic risk. And I think that logic has very much kind of, set the stage for what we currently see. We see it among Western actors. They are funding, equipping, and training local security forces to manage global security problems, locally, whether from terrorism, migration, etc. And the European Union is, I would say, very much kind of moving into this terrain big time. It has now a new facility. I'm going to have to look at my books. European Peace Facility. They promised 5 billion euro from this year to 2027. And it's a facility that explicitly designed to not only train, as they say, but also equip these local security forces, and in particular in the MENA region. So capacity building is also really a form of externalizing, right, this its own security. And we can, I think, quite easily point to some real risks, perhaps less so for the donor, but certainly so for local conflict complexes. What we have seen in Afghanistan this summer is to some extent also an extreme example. But this is not the first time that Western actors have abandoned, let's say, their local partners. We saw it in northern Syria, 2017. And I think there are a lot of local partners, so-called, that are a little shaky right now with this approach. So security is driving, I think, the EU's approach. The thing is that not only is it fairly short term, it doesn't have clear objectives, so it's difficult to measure success effects. Yeah, it is also quite intransparent. So we don't really know who gets funded with what. There's a lot of secrecy surrounding these practices. Hopefully that will be less the case with the European level, but I don't think necessarily it will be easier to measure effects.
May I ask, Michael, to Simone or Raffaella or you, isn't that also, thirdly, destabilizing locally? If you subcontract security and you give arms to kind of local, whatever, militia to do your bidding without considering. So the whole discourse that at least the EU cares about stability. Okay, it doesn't care about, human rights and other good things, but at least stability. But no, even that goal is shaken. So maybe that's a very dark picture, but what do you think?
I will have to have a comment on that. I mean, absolutely. I think this is highly destabilizing for the countries where this happens. Okay, there isn't, it may have a shorter term stabilizing effect in some cases, but overall it tends to complicate things massively. Of course, and we look at the Sahel. This is a classic example where I must say, and European actors are by far the only ones involved, but what we see is a militarization of states that have no legitimacy locally. So their only manifestation, their only footprint in their own states is a coercive one, a militaristic one. And this will have serious implications for stability of that entire belt, which is the borderlands of the borderlands. So they are really not that far away. So it will, I think, eventually come back to the EU or Europe as well.
So it can turn out to be counterproductive in practice very often, and achieve the opposite of the effect intended. You asked you said without an objective or without a clear objective. There may be some economic objectives, energy objectives, migration objectives, but what about the sort of geopolitical dimension? To what extent should we understand European action in this area in terms of great power rivalry, the roles of Turkey, of the Gulf states, of Saudi Arabia, of potentially China, Russia? Maybe in Libya, some of that came together. But do you think that this is a major driver of action by the EU?
Yes, is the short answer. I think, as I said, I kind of sketched out this slightly provocatory picture of interventions, but I think it's also fairly accurate. And I think that the EU and, you know, the European actors are certainly aware that this is an arena where all the local and global contenders are playing, and they also want to be a part. This has to do with influence, and it's not that easy to say, you know, that there are just direct economic, you know, hidden agendas or so. I think it's more complicated, but it's really, and you see it even like in smaller European actors that don't necessarily, you know, it will not you know, make a great difference is if Norway trains, you know, a unit of soldiers somewhere in something, but they are there, and it creates legitimacy for the overall, you know, mission, and it also, you know, create some kind of cookie points in Washington or wherever you want to catch them. So I do really think so. And, you know, what we see in security assistance, as I call it, or, you know, this external kind of security promotion or assistance is, of course, yeah, this is absolutely not a Western phenomenon only. And in fact, there you will have others that do it much better. We can look at Iran. I mean, yes, what they do in the Middle East is labeled in oh so many ways, but honestly, it's not that different, right? Actually, they're kind of good at it. So, you know, this is the model what we have right now. And that's when the whole language about norms and values become fairly, yeah, hypocritical, I suppose.
Maybe to wrap up this phase of the discussion, we have a question from one of our students online. And perhaps I could just put the same question to each of you and then open up to those here in the auditorium. And the question is essentially, given the picture that you have given of this relationship, which the questioner finds convincing, the question really is, if there is a vicious cycle, what can the EU do to break out of that cycle? What could happen to change this kind of post-colonial or imperial relationship? Kalypso, would you have a try?
No, I want to hear Raffaella
Okay,
first.
Raffaella.
Because she's thought very hard about it. Tentatively.
Yeah, no, I should remember what I wrote, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oops.
No. Well, in fact, yeah, I mean, we have been, I mean, everybody's studying European relations with the Middle East for the last 20, 25 years. I mean, we have been saying this, a lot of the same things for so many years, right? I think, first of all, you have to really address the trade issue, right? You need fairer terms of trade. It doesn't make sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense that the Europeans export industrial products to the markets in North Africa and the Middle East, are very protective about agricultural products, and then think about putting aid. Right? I mean, of course, there are logics behind that, obviously. I mean, the agricultural lobby in Europe is rather strong, and so on and so on. And I think that there has to be a rethink there. There has also to be, in my view, perhaps this whole, I mean, again, there are reports prepared by the Commission whenever a new free trade agreement was basically on the agenda. Independent studies that were saying, okay, I mean, if you implement this type of, if you want to implement this type of free trade agreement or an updated free trade agreement, DCFTAs, for example, well, the European Union should fund much more vocational training, education, social services, health services, and so on and so on. So more money has to be put there. Then there is the issue of, well, the big norms, right? Of course, now with this geopolitical competition, the Europeans will talk even less about human rights and democracy because others don't do that either, right? I mean, assistance by other actors don't come with any strings attached or different types of strings attached. So, but I still believe that, you know, serious human rights violations have to be addressed. And there should be some sort, I mean, conditionality is an ugly word, but there should be some awareness and some response to very serious human rights violations. Then there's the whole issue of migration. I mean, the migration policy where the member states play a much stronger role, right? Because it's the competence of the member states. And the whole migration policy, the European migration policy is, well, it's a scandal, right? It's really a scandal. Again, under the heading of stability and security, basically, I mean, Italy in this case are paying some militias to guard the borders in Libya, where the state doesn't have, I mean, which state, right? And also basically then are open to the blackmail, right? I mean, so, and 20,000, I think the number is 20,000 people that went missing or drowned in the Mediterranean Sea since between 2014 and 2020, right? So, and we know about how Libya, for example, treats migrants, right? I mean, and everybody in Europe knows. I mean, everybody cares to know. So again, migration policy, there has to be a change there as well, because it doesn't make sense to basically put a lot of money in training, again, training coast guards and partly some militias and donating patrol boats and so on and so on. And then thinking that the problem will stop, right? And also thinking that climate change in the region will force even more people to leave, right? And again, that is completely counterproductive. So instead of putting the money there, why not? I mean, again, I sound like a super idealist now, but why not putting money on training migrants, providing also legal venues for migration? That could be really a way out, right? Thinking about some ideas, circular migration. I mean, there are ideas around. It's not that there are no ideas. Yeah, I think that would be my top priorities.
I can, Michael, kind of expand on this because of Raffaella saying that sounds idealistic, but actually it isn't. It's realistic because first of all, we need to change the narrative in Europe today. We know that if there's one time bomb in the EU, it's demography. In 20 years' time, we will need 70 million non-EUans to pay for our retirements, and at least the oldies like me, like that's coming way before 20 years' time. Europe needs, new blood, needs the migrants for this reason. And of course, you can't go against public opinion. But I'm not sure public opinion is so incapable of understanding that. It's like no politician articulates this. And moreover, there are many pockets around Europe that want to receive migrants, either because they have areas that are depleted, we know this in Italy, but also in Spain, or because they have a different understanding. Barcelona wanted to open its route, and that we didn't need to distinguish between migrant and refugees, but that's another big conversation. So there is a deeper questioning of the state as gatekeeper of, the states, the EU, but through Frontex, because it's more or less now pooled together, and that externalization of border management is through Frontex. But still, the member states decide who comes in under what condition, the money put in training, everything you were saying. But often local communities want to do things. So state, just keep out of it. Okay, then they can circulate. But if there are people who want to bring migrants in. So I think that a lot of the story we're talking about is about migration. A lot of the pathologies that, all of us here are worried about. It's not like we think the EU is so mean and wants to kill people in the Mediterranean, but it's the direct impact of a kind of a pathology and obsession with these migrants. So I think a lot can be done on this, and if you wrap this in your point about big norms and geopolitics, but so how do we Europeans in this geopolitical world think about these big norms? We're never going to have an army. It's not going to happen. Michael, I'd love to hear what you think about it. But okay, we're in NATO. Our force in the world is normative. We are killing that force with the hypocrisy and double standards. We need to think about our relationship with the world differently and act differently to be credible in the world. And that's actually geostrategic. This is what we can oppose to the Chinas of this world, and even to some extent, to the Russians and to. So I think that our even real strategic thinking, would call for Europe to act differently, starting home, basically in the Mediterranean. Yeah, and I just want to, as a footnote, to say that I spent some time this summer, in camps in Lesbos, and those migrants and refugees, especially from Afghanistan, they have so much to offer. They're so brilliant and full of energy, etc. They should be here in the classroom. They should be here with, and that's so it's not idealistic. It's actually egoistic, or to bring them in, in different ways.
Let me just add one. Let me just add here. I mean, I think that what worries me is that we had Arab uprisings, right, in the region, and it was very clear what that was about. Now the situation has not changed since then, right? And in many cases has become even worse. So, I don't know. I mean, the numbers of how many unemployment, rising inequalities, crony capitalism, corruption, authoritarianism, violation of human rights, and so on, that has not changed, right? That has in some cases become worse. So it's it's actually naive to think you can just keep a lid on everything and work with authoritarian regimes and co-opt them, and then somehow things will be all right. I mean, that is not going to happen, in my view. I don't want to be pessimistic, but
Simone.
Yes, okay. No, I just wanted to say one thing, and I think a lot of this, to me, is also connected with this fear of populism. And we are all somehow afraid of populism. We have seen how populism work and can be destructive for our political system. But the thing about externalizing security, in particular migration, cannot be justified on the basis that we are afraid that our children and colleagues and neighbors are going to be radicalized or vote for populist parties. To me, this is an insane logic, which I really think, however, has been internalized somehow, to the point where, you see how robust these regimes are now. This summer, we had in Italy, a Libyan Coast Guard vessel donated by Italy, shooting with live ammunition directly onto a ship, small boat full of migrants. And it was reported in the big newspapers. It also was reported by The Guardian, and then nothing. These things happen, and they are seen as anomalies, unfortunate ones. And it's so unfortunate with these thousands of people that died, that they are somehow justified, right? And I think somehow this fear of ourselves and, populism must be dealt with in so many other ways. These are our problems. There's something fundamentally, wrong that, elites haven't been able to pick up, and they need to, adjust our systems and not allow, humans to die on our shore. So yeah, that's my passionate speech about that.
Thanks, Simone. Let's turn to those who are here this evening. Is there anybody here who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Just raise your hand, and if you'd introduce yourself, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for this talk. So I'm Victor Lachny, I'm a MAIA candidate. At some point at the beginning of the conversation, I think it's Professor Nicolaïdis, you mentioned the fact that the policy towards civil society was, in those countries, was a big black hole of the EU policies. So if you could maybe elaborate a bit on the extent to which those policies relate to the migration issue, and potentially also on the long-term impact of those policies towards civil societies in those countries, and the incentive for the EU to develop those.
I was just speaking about, the Arab Spring 10 year. We just commemorated. I'm not sure what terms you use. Marked. Thank you. The 10th anniversary, and what you and of course, as Raffaella says, what happens in a society where people who were 20 are now 30 or have been completely suppressed in almost all, and even Tunisia, which was the one kind of ray of hope. Well, what's going to happen there? First, the waste of all this youth and all this energy and all this intelligence, all this access that they have to the world. You suppress it. There is no employment. There is no capacity to express yourself, etc. I mean, it's more or less bad, depending which country you look at. So I mean, there are people who say, well, there are rays of hope because lots is happening underground. People have become teachers or whatever, carers, and they do things and they speak. But others tell us that, no, there's a lot of forgetting. You know, if you're 10 years old or 15 years old in Egypt today, and if your family hasn't told you story, do you really know what happened then? So it's a very complex story. But then you're asking, well, what should the EU do? Well, to start with, not prop up with lots of subsidies authoritarian regimes under the pretext or the false belief that this will serve the stability. We've all been talking in different ways about the fact that no, in the longer run, you know, if you create countries with this huge injustice and frustration on the part of huge swathes of the population, with the monopolization and extraction of wealth by a small elite, that, you know, you're going to create the conditions under which, I mean, even for your own self-interest as Europeans, under which these societies will be, you know, self-destruct and then create problems with the EU. And if they do ever liberate themselves, they certainly won't be grateful to the EU when they observe this cooptation, this mutual cooptation between Europe and the elite. So I don't even think it's an ideal. I mean, there is an idealistic dimension. How can we be so hypocritical, so double standards to support dictators who torture people in jail and create economic system that leaves so many on the wayside? It's very shocking. But even in our own self-interest as European, I say "our" in that sense, it doesn't make any sense in the longer run, in the wise way. And Simone is so right that, you know, when you talk about these things with European politicians, and I did a lot of that in Greece this summer, yes, what you hear is a pseudo appeal to public opinion, to populists. That's what they want. You know, they want us to, you know, not rock the boat, etc. But it's not clear where they get that from. You know, so, but I'm sure you have much more to say.
Anyone else like to respond? Yes, please. Wait for the mic.
My name is Francesca. I'm a MAIR student. So my question is, don't you think it's also a matter of representation within European institutions and in general in the political arena? Because, you know, we have all this male-dominated actually policy environment. Also, it's also a matter of generation, right? So we see this system, as you all said, that it doesn't make sense either economically or from a security point of view. It's going to explode, another uprising is going to be there. So do you think that a generational change might, you know, might overcome this whole situation? Because I don't see a way out right now. And it doesn't make, as you said, it doesn't make sense. Like even in Italy, we have many job opportunities that Italians are simply not interested in. And probably people coming here will be happy to take this position. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yes, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure, to be quite honest. They seem, first of all, it's going to take a while, especially looking at Italy, if I may. I mean, it's not like the young are forthcoming. Also, when you talk about politics, because, well, yeah, it's a complicated business to get into, and a lot of young, talented people prefer to do other things, right? But in general, of course, it's also it's a slow process. But what we have seen, and I think, you know, the authoritative voices on this over to my left have described this since 1995. Yes, there has maybe been ups and downs in terms of optimism, but it's also been quite consistent, you know, and persistent. This line that what the European Union, what it does, who it is, and how it looks at things. And then the security aspect has picked up, you know, particularly strongly, and kind of skewed things perhaps, you know, in an even worse direction. But what we see, and this is, I think we really see a stickiness of these discourses. I wanted to point out, though, that, you know, also my own research, for example, on Euro-Mediterranean energy issues. I'm not an expert on energy, but I'm interested in practices and so on. So I had a look at the energy world. And what you know, there are, certainly at the time, there were very strong, you know, ideas about how European Union would export its regulatory regime in the field of energy to the region, to the southern neighborhood, which was insane. I mean, you know, this is about cutting subsidies, for example, you know, marketizing, liberalizing, also establishing independent, you know, auditors and, you know, watchdogs and market watchdogs and so on, which is completely alien to, you know, countries that very much rely on their popular support also through subsidies in many sectors, etc. So, however, a lot of and maybe, you know, I can tell us a little bit more about this, the frustration I felt from the practitioners about these, you know, goals and discourses about exporting European regimes in such an area, such as energy, where the European Union itself perhaps isn't fully harmonized. You know, there was a great frustration on the part of those who actually implement it. So there may be, you know, that something will come up either from new generations who see things differently, from, you know, practitioners who, you know, see the frustration in, I see it in security as well, in security sector reform, which is extremely difficult to do. And they're, you know, we're much more happy when these more pragmatic frameworks came along. But I also see there's a lot of continuity. So something must happen, I think. Something a little bit dramatic, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, certainly I'm very hopeful, right, that the younger generations will change a few. Of course, we always have to remember that they're very important business interests, right? And that these business interests have not changed, and the lobbies have not changed that much. But I think that if there is a change in Europe towards green energy, right, that may change some things in North Africa and the Middle East. If there's less reliance on fossil fuel, that may a bit change the equation. I mean, for now, for example, Egypt is in a very good position because of the gas fields that have been discovered off the coast of Egypt, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt is basically thought of as a hub from which natural gas can then be exported to Europe, right? Algeria, of course, also has a very strong position because of natural gas. And Libya, obviously, Libya, not to talk about the Gulf states, but that's a different discussion. I mean, that's not the neighborhood, let's say. And yes, and if there should be what I very much hope, no, that if we move towards greener energy, then the power of some of these states, of the governments in particular, no, that may very much change. And there's perhaps, I mean, also with the younger generation having much more awareness regarding the issue of climate change. I mean, there I see a real connection and ray of hope, let's say.
And perhaps, you know, this is maybe, but I speak under both of your control, you know, an area where exporting some of EU practices might sometimes be right. For instance, the EU is exploring these local energy communities, and the whole idea that to deal with the transition, the energy transition and the green transition, we have to produce our energy, you know, much more localized with local contracts, and you have your own solar panels, and you have other, eventually we each carry our capacity to produce energy too. I mean, there's a lot of things, and it's happening in Europe. Maybe that's the kind of thing that could also empower civil society, you know, in the MENA region. I mean, you could start to think about the linkages. But I would also add that, because Simone was saying, well, you know, many young people, it's true, don't want to go in politics. And I see with my students, and probably you guys are the same, you know, there's a kind of sense, there's either you're very activist, but in the NGO world, you have a sense of powerlessness, the world is falling to pieces, what can I do? But, you know, there are also things you, first of all, don't despair. I mean, politics can change things, and it's really important to hope that the new generation will have levers of power, and it can do things through politics, through the state, you know, try to access these levers of power. But another is business. So businesses can be the bad guy, but it can be, and Nina and I were discussing this earlier, you know, there is corporate social responsibility. There are, you know, CFOs and actors in businesses that are increasingly interested and wanting to change business practices. There is UN encouragement under, you know, both the Global Compact and the Pact between business and on big principles, human rights and environment. Things are moving, and one can act in different places. So it's not entirely hopeless. And I mean, I'm with you, you know, new generation. Yeah, go for it, guys, you know, change things. That's why we're still, you know, in this business of teaching and profit. We believe in you guys.
Well, we could end on that encouraging note, but we do have just time for a last comment or question. Andrea.
Good evening. My name is Andrea Palazzi. I'm from Rome, and I study European public policy or SAIS. I have a question for Professor Del Sarto. You mentioned legal migration, and the European Parliament and the Council recently agreed on a new version of the Blue Card Directive. Unfortunately, the previous version hasn't worked that efficiently. There is data from the Commission that prove that. What are your hopes, expectations, and thoughts of these new versions? And if a blue card in general, like the approche, might work in Europe along the same lines as the green card in the United States? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the previous system did not work, and it's also, again, I mean, there is the blue card system is again based on skills and labor market, and that is certainly a good start. But of course, there's also the issue of refugees, which is a different, perhaps a different conversation. Am I optimistic that this new blue card will work? Well, I think today I want to be optimistic. But of course, one of the problems is still that migration is a competence of the member states. So that's the tricky issue about that, right? So even if the Commission comes up with a brilliant plan, then you need the member states actually to agree, and in the Council as well. But yeah, and then we basically are back to the issue that that we all, Simone and we all mentioned, that migration has become so politicized in the member states of the European Union, and some more than in others. But I mean, it's really giving rise to right-wing populism and xenophobia and so on, which I agree with Simone is insane. So I think that I'm not sure that's an answer, but I mean, I've tried to give you an answer.
Was there a last request from the floor?
My question is a bit big, I guess, but like, sorry, Zaina Al-Sadi, I'm from Jordan, and I'm a first-year Maya student. My question is that the EU is basically every year having governmental talks with the countries in the MENA region and giving a huge amount of international aid. And the governmental talks are basically to agree on what are the what are the conditions for getting that aid, but at the same time they're not making sure that the conditions are met. Why is that? Is it because they're afraid of the democracies that might come from? Because a lot of it comes for political development, economic development, social development. So are they afraid of what might come if democracies happen? Are they afraid of the economic development or of trade? What are they basically afraid of, you think?
Thank you. I think that's a bit what we talked about. No? There is development aid, and there are also different types of agreements that are signed with the governments. And very often the Europeans do say, but you should respect human rights, right? But then if the country doesn't do it, then nothing happens, right? I don't think that it's a fear of democracy. I mean, I don't think that that is the point. I think the point is really that first, there is no real follow-up capacity. No, I mean, to go there and really check, have you done that? But more than the issue of capacity is it's political will, right? Because again, I mean, if you think, I mean, the Arab uprisings also had an impact on the thinking of European policymakers, I think, right? And so this idea that as long as it's stable, yeah, a little bit human rights violations, we can take that, right? We can accept that. And I really think that it's has so much become about stability and of course counterterrorism, and in some cases blocking migration, right? That it's this type of co-opting basically the governments of the member states. And as long as it's fine for the governments and for, let's say, the elites in Europe, right, or the governments in Europe, then we have a deal in a way, right? And what is completely ignored in all of that is human rights violations and lack of accountability, corruption, crony capitalism, and so on and so forth.
But can we add that, I mean, in the same vein, but there's almost a cognitive or ideational, obstacle here, which is that in Europe, we invented the state, or at least a certain form of the state. And it's with other states that if you're the EU, a collection of states, you can make deals, that kind of deal. If, for instance, so in your part of the world, I was reading a lot on Lebanon recently, but you will know better. Clearly there's been a lot of NGOs and citizens group that kind of have been a proxy for the state. They're delivering, as well as religious group, but they're delivering state functions. It kind of, you don't need a PhD in development aid to kind of realize that your money will go much further if you support these groups, these civil society groups that are kind of trying to repair Lebanon. It's not just the political class, the state has completely hollowed out. So, echoing your question, why the hell isn't the EU really working very closely with all these groups and recreate a state, help recreate, because at the end of the day, it's they who will do it. And in part, so there are underlying capitalist interests, there's structural reasons, but there is also almost a cognitive reason that the EU supports states. It's a kind of a state machinery itself. It's a machine to create consensus among states. So we need to have other states elsewhere. And so if there are other models elsewhere, the EU kind of political imagination that can't really take it in. I hope that will change because it doesn't make sense, but.
Yeah, no, just to follow up on your answer. I mean, there are of course also accountability issues involved. It's much easier to deal with the state, if you're the European Union, than with civil society organizations. Always the fear, that you don't know where the money will go and so on and so on. But I don't think, I think that's more the state-centric perspective. But I think it's also important to keep in mind in all that's the role of MENA governments themselves, right? Because they very much learned how to talk the talk, right? And so it's
Yeah, I've been struggling not to put back on my old EU hat as I've been listening to. I've been, but it's been coming down on my head, and I just can't resist entirely. But I think when you look back on the history of the last 20 years, there were serious efforts made to inject both the human rights and civil society component into the EU's relations with these countries. I mean, on the civil society front, there is a civil society facility, and efforts are made to bring together people-to-people contacts between groups, civil society groups in Europe and in the region. And it's not entirely unsuccessful, but there's a major obstacle on the side of the governments that tend to adopt rules that make it difficult for foreign donors to give grants to civil society bodies in those countries. But nonetheless, a certain amount has been achieved in this area, modest and by no means adequate for sure. And, you know, on the civil society and on the democracy and human rights front, I think in a way the EU is sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Because when this neighborhood policy was launched as the kind of successor superimposed on the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, the Barcelona process, the Union for the Mediterranean, so many confusing frameworks. But the basic idea was from the beginning to provide benefits, trade benefits, financial assistance, and so on, in exchange for commitments to human rights, rule of law. They initially democracy gave way to governance because democracy seemed to be overambitious. And in fact, you know, officials from the Commission, supported by the European Parliament, went round the whole region, getting governments to sign up to action plans in which they committed to these kind of reforms. And then after the Arab uprisings, the EU invented this brilliant phrase, more for more, which was very hard to implement. But the idea basically was that the more these countries show they're serious about these reforms, the more the EU would be willing to support them and bring them into EU programs and provide more assistance. There have been, I think, basically two types of problem. One problem is in the countries themselves, where the governments really might have signed up to these documents, but had no intention to implement them. And the other problem is on the EU side, because my interpretation is that the governments of the member states of Italy, France, Spain, Greece, and the northern member states as well, they're perfectly content to ease their conscience, as it were, by delegating to the European Commission and others the proclamation of these values and the efforts to implement them while they get on with business as usual. I mean, if you're Italy and you look at Egypt these days, then the big national oil company is a major component in your relations with Egypt. And then you've got the Commission delegated to try and promote civil society and to support rule of law and so on, which is a joke, of course. And the governments just don't take it seriously if they know that Italy, France, Greece are getting on with business as usual. So, you know, it's not that I wouldn't like to leave you with the impression that the EU, the institutions of the EU, the elected members of the European Parliament and so on are indifferent to democracy and human rights and civil society. They're not. But, you know, they're faced with recalcitrance in the governments of the countries and indifference or competing interests among member state governments. And it's very hard to break through. It's my interpretation. I mean, this may open a whole new debate, but let me just then.
Playing a trick on us.
No, in all fairness, let me give each of you, you know, the floor briefly just to wrap up and disagree with me, please, or just some parting thoughts maybe for the students. Shall we start with you, Simone?
Yeah, no, I wanted to say that I think there, you know, the European Union has a theory of change, which is flawed. It is based on its own, you know, historical experience. It is based on, you know, how democracies come about. It is based on the role of civil society and this kind of magic formula that supporting civil society somehow will change anything. First of all, I think civil society in the MENA region is actually kind of offended with the European Union and its turn to stabilization, you know, as a primary approach. Then again, secondly, of course, we have the fact that civil society in this region is often organized around political Islam, which is again complicated. So, you know, this thing about civil society, I have some issues with, and I think it's kind of, you know, yeah, that would be just, I suppose, my final words. Thanks.
I'm critical of European Union and European policies, of course, but I mean, I'm very much in favor of European integration. I should say that, perhaps. And I don't think, again, as we said from at the beginning, I don't think that it's about bad intentions. It's just that there are a lot of institutional problems. It's the whole way that the European Union and its member states function, who is responsible for what and who's fighting with whom. And the fact that there are 27 member states does not make things much easier, of course. But I think that we also have always to consider, I mean, even if the criticism has been on the side of the European Union, on the European side, of course, there is also quite a responsibility of MENA governments themselves, right? And because, as I was saying before, I mean, playing the game basically, and oppressing civil society and so on and so forth. But I think that, you know, we really need to rethink and to think ahead how we can, in the interest of the people of the MENA region, and also in the interest of the Europeans, basically.
Today, we are trying to kind of experiment with reinventing democracy in a different way in the EU. Don't hold your breath, it's complicated. It's a challenge, but we're talking about citizens' assembly, innovations. You know, Bologna hundreds of years ago was like was a republic, and, you know, was self-governing, and we're playing with all this. And in fact, modernity to a great extent is, you know, is universal. All around the world, people, citizens are connected, and they relate to our modernity, with some national filters and culture or religious, as Simone was saying. But at the end of the day, and especially the new generation, the digital natives, you know, all relate to these big challenges of capture of power and wealth by the few and not by the many. And that's like the oldest, you know, problem of our societies. And it's a problem we have within Europe too. And so part of the challenge has to be in our minds as Europeans to be able to accept, to reverse the gaze, reverse the democratic gaze. We can learn from them at least as much as they can learn from us, that it's a mutuality kind of relation. And even though you're right, Michael, that, you know, and as Raffaella was echoing, yes, there are good intentions, and there are all these, you know, EU Commission people running around and telling governments to sign things. But is it really the case that in most of these, you know, highly competent people, there is this capacity to decenter, to think of Europe as literally a post-colonial power, not just in temporal time, but transcending really its colonial past? I mean, is that a kind of a self-reflexive exercise that characterizes the EU today? You know, I'm not sure, which is why I love the book so much, because sorry to kind of fall back on my feet here. But, you know, I hope we can make sure that everyone in this room buys it and reads it, or reads it in the library.
Thank you so much. Do join me in thanking our three panelists for really what was an excellent everybody online.